Good morning, everyone. This is John Rest, chicken farmer from Seymour, Indiana. I am here with my good friends Michelle Harder, who is an attorney at law and who I consider to be the Aaron Brockovich of Indiana election law, and my very good friend Mike Wilson, who I actually grew up working with at Roseacre Farms, my family's egg farm. Mike, Michelle, welcome.
Good morning, John.
Well, good morning. Thanks for the invitation, John.
Today, Indiana election law, where we stand in Indiana, we have something called the two primary rule. Michelle, would you like to give a brief explanation on what the two primary rule is and how that relates to Indiana voters?
Well, John, I like to call it the Incumbent Protection Act. I think the more watered down version is the two primary rule, right? So the Incumbent Protection Act is a statute here in Indiana that was recently, I think it was back in 2022, it became the law, where in order to run for office as a Republican or a Democrat, so most people identify as one or the other, right? So in order to run for either major party, you have to either vote in two primaries consecutively for that primary or for that party, and or you have to get the county party chair to certify that you're a member of the party. So that's the rule now. But before it was just one primary and party chair certification. And then prior to that, it was one primary, party chair certification, or you just saying you affiliate with a party if you didn't vote. So over time, this law is increasing the responsibility of someone if they want to run for office. And when most people go to vote or they don't vote or they're considering running for office, they're not thinking about, oh, I need to vote in these primaries. Most people don't vote in primaries. At least 81% of Hoosiers do not vote in a primary, even if they identify as Republican or Democrat.
Right. For instance, Michelle, when I got into this, I didn't think it would be any issue for me to run for elected office in Indiana because I've always been a good citizen. I voted in every presidential election since I could, when I was 18 years old. I've never missed one election for the presidency, never. And I thought, well, that's what you have to do. That's what being a good citizen is all about. That means I thought I should automatically be able to run for office someday myself if I wanted to. That didn't really cross my mind when I was 18, but I was always a citizen. And just like a lot of people in Indiana, I always, took a strong interest in who our leaders were. And so I wanted to vote, but I didn't always vote in the Republican primary. I only ever gave money to Republican candidates my entire life. But guess what? Because I hadn't voted in two Republican primaries, the state officials decided, no, you can't do that. And you want to go into why.
So that gets us to why I call this the Incumbent Protection Act. So this, in most counties in Indiana, it's a super majority red state. There's Republican leadership, and often the primary election, there's no selections. There's one person running for each office, and they just expect to pass right through to the general election. And so there's not a lot of reason to go vote for the primaries, and most people don't. And it protects the incumbents who stay in office because the primary is the election, and there's a very small minority of people who go vote and make that decision. And then once a Republican gets on the general ballot, they win by a landslide here in Indiana. So the law sort of operates to keep the status quo. And when this amendment was passed to add the second primary, people were very angry during, the COVID times with small businesses being shut down and mandates and other things. And so the government knew that come primary time, they might have some challengers.
Because they would be facing people like me, because that's exactly what happened. My family firsthand saw what government action did towards not just egg farmers, but for churches. Churches were closed down, but liquor stores were allowed to stay open. Our business suffered. Universities quit serving eggs because schools were shut down. We lost so much business because of COVID. And so I thought we need people in government who have real world experience, who knows what really is going on in the world, not people who live in an ivory tower in Washington, D.C. So I thought I would be welcome in the Republican Party in Indiana. One, it's because what you said, Indiana's a red state. So I thought, well, they're going to really like me because I am redder than red. I am a true blue conservative. I believe in Margaret Thatcher. I believe in Ronald Reagan. I believe in Donald Trump for what his economic policies stand for. The Republican Party in Indiana, unfortunately, is not that. The Republican Party in Indiana is really the party of state government. We have all these elected officials who write the rules now on who can run for office. And so it really is a backhanded way to protect themselves against people like me who are fed up and say, hey, wait a second, I want to stand up. I want to run for office. You know, I've worked my whole life working as a plumber, a teacher, nurse, chicken farmer. I have some experience I can bring to the table. Some common sense I think that I can bring to the table. But the elected officials in Indiana say, no, you have to follow all these steps, or we have to allow you on by checking off a box. You want to go off on that checking off the box part.
That's interesting you say checking off the box. I mean, one of the ways to get on the ballot if you didn't have the voting record, which most Hoosiers don't, is party chair certification. And certification is undefined. And so the party chair likes you, you're on. They don't like you, you're off. And so it's very subjective. There's no guidelines. It's crazy. I mean, what can you do? Can you pay them off? I mean, we really don't know what the parameters are for John. He didn't find out why they didn't consider him a Republican until he filed a legal action, and then we heard all these excuses in court that were never presented to him before we filed suit. So
Right.
It's kind of a mystery. How do you satisfy the certification rule?
Well, you know, and in my instance, I talked to my county chairwoman very early. She was like the second person I talked to about running for the U.S. Senate. And for the first several months, it was no problem at all. Oh, yeah, this will be no problem. You're great. You know, it'll be fine. And then she all of a sudden changed, and I think it's because so much pressure was put on her. And so you talk about the county chairs being able to say yes or no. I think a lot of them would say yes to more people, but they get pressure by the people above them. And so in the instance of my county chair, you know, we have to get into Jamie Knoll, the 9th District Republican chairman, who's now sitting in jail.
Well, Jamie Knoll was recently brought up on many charges for embezzling millions. He took a quick plea deal. You know, now they're selling off his property to pay restitution for what he did, and you know, he was the supervisor to the party chair that was supposed to make the certification for John's candidacy.
And so, you know, I asked the question, what really went on behind the scenes there? Why did my county chair change her opinion on me being able to run? That's what happened. So we took this through the legal route. And when we come back from the break, we'll get more into that. And we'll go through line by line on exactly what was happening with each step on that. So when we come back, we'll do that. You are listening to The John Rush Show on Freedom 95. Welcome back. I am here with Michelle Harder, the Aaron Brockovich of Indiana election law. So before the break, Michelle and I were talking about, you know, early on, I didn't think it would be an issue for me to run. I thought the Indiana Republican Party would welcome me in, you know, with my story, my conservatism, my donation history to the Republican Party. I have only ever given money to Republicans my entire life, never $1 to the Democratic Party. So I thought, oh, this is, you know, it won't be a problem whatsoever. However, I found out very quickly, nope, you're not allowed to run. You're not one of us. You're not part of the government establishment. We can't control you. So Michelle, here's what happened. In June, I got warned, oh, you didn't vote in the 2 primary thing. You're going to have to get your county chair to officially sign off. So at that point, I called my county chairwoman, and she said, yes, there's the piece of paperwork. Let's meet and we'll talk about it. And so she delayed me for a couple weeks. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And so the process on that was I prepared my donation history and my rock rib Republican credentials and my thoughts, my ideas, and what I wanted to bring to the Senate. Specifically, I think we need a real conservative, someone who will fight for fiscal responsibility. But all that fell on deaf ears. So in July, I went to a meeting with her and several other of the local county officials. I said, let me make my case. Let me prove that I am all of this. And they said, yeah, okay, we'll fine. We'll listen to all that. It was still, we were listening. But what happened was when I filed federal paperwork in, I don't remember the specific date on that, but when I filed that set off triggers in Washington, D.C., and alarms went off. nasty negative press coverage started popping up about me, and then suddenly the story changed. Oh, this John Rust is a liberal Democrat, which I'm certainly not. The stories on Breitbart and stories.
Yeah, and I also remember that, your would-be opponent had announced his candidacy very early, and then immediately after he announced, before you had become a public figure, every Republican establishment person here in Indiana and nationwide just endorsed him immediately without a primary, without anything. They just endorsed him.
Yeah, I remember going to the Indiana State GOP dinner in Indianapolis, and it was a fait accompli. Everything was predetermined for Jim Banks. The governor endorsed Jim Banks. The state party endorsed Jim Banks. The National Republican Committee endorsed Jim Banks. They did not want any opposition. And who was the people behind that? That was the Mitch McConnells, the special interests that really control, it turns out, Indiana politics, and not Hoosiers. That's what upset me. I think in the end, they should have allowed me on the ballot, because it should be up to Hoosiers to vote for who they want to be in the U.S. Senate, not the people like Mitch McConnell and the Washington insiders.
That's right, John. And so I guess we should mention how you and I met. So prior to me meeting John, I had two other plaintiffs who were removed from the ballot, and I got involved after they were removed by the state election commission, who were two average people. One was a military veteran that was decorated, and one was a mother who I think works in pharmaceutical research. Two average people who wanted to give back, and they were removed for not meeting the two primary rule. One of them lived out of state and voted in a primary in South Carolina, and so didn't have two Indiana primaries. And so I took their cases through the trial court to appeal, and they both lost because the election had passed. So when I met John, the unique fact about him was, the election wasn't passed yet, so they couldn't claim the matter was moot. John did this proactively. So we sought to get a declaration of law to say that he could be on the ballot in advance. And so that's what we did. We filed a lawsuit seeking an injunction of the statute and declaratory judgment to say that the statute was unconstitutional. And the state fought it, and we had a little trial, and
we won.
We won, and it was a glorious victory. December 7th,
a victory for Hoosiers
last year. The judge issued a super eloquent, at least 40-pager opinion explaining how the law was unconstitutional, not just in one way, but in multiple respects under both the state and federal constitution. I think John best described that opinion as a love letter to Hoosier voters. And it was a huge victory. We got a lot of media coverage. A lot of people reached out to say that they agreed with us and they were super happy about it. But of course, the state didn't like that, and they immediately appealed.
Right. So Diego Morales
Diego Morales as Secretary of State, and the Indiana Election Commission sought an expedited appeal, and they took it directly to the Indiana Supreme Court, because under Indiana law, if you have a statute that's struck down as unconstitutional, it skips the Court of Appeals in the appellate process. So it goes directly right up to the Indiana Supreme Court.
And the state does not want normal people to be able to run for office. In a nutshell, that's what this law does, is it stops average, people that work for a living, that know the real world, from running for office.
And most people don't even know this. Even other lawyers, if I tell them about the law, and sometimes I'll ask them if they voted in two primaries for the same party, and they'll, oh no, lawyers are busy. We don't hit the primaries.
Well, a lot of people don't vote in primaries.
Yeah.
I didn't vote in primaries. I was busy working, and they say, oh, well, you should have done that. But I always voted in the fall election every presidential cycle, always.
And that's true of most folks, right? We're voting in the presidential because there's choices, but then on the county ballot, at least in Johnson County where I live, often it's unopposed races across
Correct.
The board. They don't need my vote. They're going to be selected just by, being there. And so there's a lot of people who don't go because there's no choices. And so this law creates like a cycle of disenfranchisement.
So you don't vote because there's not choices, and that it bleeds on itself. And so it is to the sad point today where Indiana is dead last in voter participation. We are dead last in folks who vote in primaries today. It's because we have no choice, because normal people can't run for election.
And it's discouraging. So people don't run, people don't vote, and it's just going to keep happening unless something changes.
And that's why I'm talking today. I want to keep fighting for Hoosiers. We can't just say, oh, that's the rule. We are stuck with these bureaucrats to run our lives forever. No, you have to stand up. So if you're out there today, go vote in the primary. They try to trick you and hide when it is and don't talk about it. But it's very important. Go vote in the primaries. It is very important. Even if you go and don't vote, at least show up and vote for one thing, just so that you're on the record and they can't keep you off the ballot in the future, even if you can't stand all the choices being given to you. And that's what we're forced with today is, we have the lesser of two evils. And that's how we got Jim Banks. He was the lesser of two evils in Indiana. I mean, the Democratic opponent was just not realistic for the state of Indiana. And so we get stuck with people like Jim Banks, who's a Mitch McConnell acolyte.
And there's an even bigger problem here, John, is even if you do go vote in the primaries, the law is as such that you can't change your mind. So you're locked into voting for the same party. If you want to run for that party at some point, you're stuck voting for them for 2 primary cycles. And so what happens if your party shifts? They leave you behind and you have to change party affiliations. Or what if you want to go independent? You can't. They will make it so you can't run for office if you do so. So you're sort of locked into voting. So not only does this law affect you as a candidate, this law affects you as a voter as well. You have to vote if you ever want to be a candidate with that in mind, which we argued is unconstitutional. You should be able to change your mind about your party affiliation. Look at how many people changed their mind this presidential cycle.
Well, this is America.
Yeah.
Mr. Smith should be able to go to Washington. Unfortunately, in Indiana, Mr. Smith can't go to Washington. In Indiana, John Russ could not go. He was barred from running for office because the establishment doesn't want that. Oddly, if you follow the letter of this law, Abraham Lincoln could not have ran in 1860 had he remained a Hoosier, because he could not have met the 2 primary rule, because technically the Indiana Republican Party was not formed in a time where he could have met the 2 primary thresholds. So he would have been barred from running for office. That is the insanity of this office. It is just a blanket protection for career insiders.
And the trial court judge even acknowledged that Abraham Lincoln said that elections belong to the people in his order. It doesn't say, he didn't say elections belong to the elected officials, right? They belong to the people. And so the people's interests and values and party affiliations may change. They're to decide. And honestly, at the end of the day, I don't know what the problem would have been with allowing John to be on the ballot and letting voters decide if he was conservative enough, right? If the argument is, like the state made, well, he's not a Republican. Why couldn't the voters make that decision? Why do we need the government to tell us who is what party? I don't think we do.
Well, I think in my case it was specifically because they did not want someone that was under their thumb. They have to have someone that will really, in the end, vote for leadership in Washington and for bills that the establishment wants, and that's why they were scared of me. I think it all boils back to Jamie Knoll, the 9th District Republican chairman, and what really went on behind the scenes. My county chairwoman, she was his treasurer of the 9th District Republican Committee and eventually vice chair, and she's chairman of that now. So it's just, one wonders what really went on behind the scenes.
And we'll never know who all was involved or what went on because of the quick plea deal. And really, it's, we've heard a little bit in the media, but not so much about what happened there.
Yeah. So interestingly, Jamie Knoll pled guilty to 27 counts of embezzlement and theft. It was around $3 million that they know of. So what he specifically apparently was doing was taking county equipment and then auctioning it off or selling it. Is that right?
Yes, and he has to pay back in restitution, I think, $3 million to just one entity that he embezzled money from, and then there's other entities that he owes hundreds of thousands of dollars to. I think I saw in the news that they're going to start selling off his property in order to pay restitution.
But that's just what the establishment's doing in Indiana. So he was 9th District Republican chairman while this was going on with me. He was also Clark County sheriff. Also, I believe he was the chair of the Clark County Republican Party.
And under the law, he's eligible to run, but you aren't.
But I'm not.
I do have a question. If you lived in a different county, I assume that the chairperson could have maybe have approved you. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes, that's a very good question. So I was actually looking into moving to another county, but we had won at the court level. So at the time of my filing, I could have just declared myself a resident of another county, and that county chair would have signed off and I could have ran. In hindsight, I probably should have done that. But at that point, the state court had ruled for me, and so I did not need to do that. I could stay a resident of my own county. So when we get back into that, we're going to go into my address and some of the other crazy parts that these people were using to try to keep me off the ballot. So once again, stay tuned. This is John Rust on Freedom 95. Good morning again, everyone. This is John Rust here with Mike Wilson and Michelle Harder. We are just digging into Indiana election law. So one interesting part on this, there is part of the Indiana election law I actually agree with. A lot of people don't. Michelle may not. And that is the petition signature thing. I worked my butt off getting over 15,000 signatures across the state of Indiana so that I would demonstrate I had popular support. People wanted me to run. I had thousands of more signatures than anyone else for the U.S. Senate. Do you want to dig into that a little bit?
Yeah, and you're right, John. I don't necessarily agree that Indiana's signature requirement is even reasonable, but it's one indicia that you have support from the Hoosiers to be on the ballot. And so if John had the support that he had, which I think might have been record-breaking.
Right. So let me dig into the details on that. Specifically, you need to have 500 signatures per congressional district. So there are 9 congressional districts in the state of Indiana, so I needed technically 4,500 verified voter signatures for me to run for the U.S. Senate or for any statewide office. Had I been running for governor or it would have been the same rule. And so I met that. I had 15,000. I had 3 times the number required.
And that's unprecedented. Most people can barely get over the line, and they'll get a few extra as a cushion. I mean, John's signature collection was remarkable. I've had clients who couldn't get enough signatures who fought the signature requirement, and John came in and he tripled it. And so that's very remarkable. And
well, I'm here with Mike Wilson, and a little bit of history on Mike. He and I worked together back in the Roseacre shop in the 1980s. I was actually his gopher. I'd take a truck around to get auto parts or whatever at the local Hoosier Parts. Remember that, Mike?
I remember that, yes.
Yes, back in the day.
That's
when I was mowing grass around the farms or, working, doing whatever. Mike was actually my boss. When I was running this campaign, Mike retired from Roseacres a few years ago, but I had ran into him and I said, hey, I have a little job for you. How would you like to drive me around the state in this campaign bus? And so he was taking me around the campaign bus along with some other drivers. And what I always found is for instance, whenever we stopped for diesel fuel somewhere, people would come up to the bus, sometimes knock on the door and say, hey, I want to meet you and talk to you. And so we'd talk to them and, they would want to come up and sign my signature requirement. That was an awesome thing, just to show up in the middle of nowhere and people would, come up and say, hey, we believe in you. We want you to run. We are so sick of what the establishment is doing to this. And I had that over and over all across the state of Indiana. When they saw that bus, they say, hey, it's time for a change. We want people who will fight for us, not the establishment. So all through my campaign, because I was making it a big deal, and I still am, my opponent, Jim Banks, he was very much in the pocket of Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader. I thought we needed someone who is closer to, Trump and Reagan philosophy and not just establishment philosophy.
Didn't you have a joint petition you wanted Jim Banks to sign that you'd signed to remove him as majority leader, and you circulated it and you were waiting for a response, and I don't think we ever got
he refused to sign it. We took it up to his congressional office up in Fort Wayne. The first time I went up there, I was able to walk into the office and they made a big deal. You can't be in here. You're not from our congressional district. If you're not from his congressional district, you're banned from his office. And so they banned me or anyone else in the state of Indiana. If you're not from his office, you couldn't go in there. So
then he
that was
was
kind of
posted.
interesting that he's, in a taxpayer-funded office, but a citizen of Indiana is not welcome in there. That was kind of bizarre.
And then we found out the real truth, right? He was putting negative social media posts about you specifically after that. So it wasn't necessarily that you weren't a constituent.
Well,
It was,
they're scared of the people.
Right.
That's what it is. They have this wall of people in front of them that you can't interact with them. So I went around to a lot of Republican dinners all across the state of Indiana. And the one thing I noticed about Jim Banks and these other candidates, they're all the same. They don't interact with the people. They only interact with the party leaders. So we get stuck with this kind of inbred leadership where everyone is, all from the same thing. It's a club. But having said that, there are some excellent county chairs out there, and I don't want to besmirch all of them. I'd say most of them are good, but there's definitely some very bad eggs, obviously. Look what happened to me in Jackson County. Yeah, so Mike was talking about my address. Interestingly, one of the first things that happened when I was running is I live in the woods near Acme, Indiana, and my address, my physical house address, is about 3/4 of a mile from my mom's house. I have always, for 40 years or whatever, used her mailbox as my mailing address for my driver's license, passport, everything.
because you don't receive mail in.
Because I don't have a mailbox back where I live.
I think it was called the House in the Woods by opposing counsel.
And it really is a house in the woods. I'm a Hoosier. I live out in the woods. And there should be nothing wrong with that, I don't think.
And they took John's deposition when we filed suit to try to get some admissions out of him about him not living at the address that he claimed he lived at, and they were hammering into the address issue. And John's not a lawyer, and he doesn't appreciate the distinction between where he receives mail and his legal address. So we kind of delved into that, and finally, after all the badgering, I asked John on redirect, hey, if you did something incorrectly, you'll fix it, right? Before the election? Yes. Okay, well, how is this an issue, right?
Yeah, so I fixed it. But I mean, they were like, oh my gosh, they had a name for this rule. There was a politician who lived in a different district and used a different address. I live in the same district as my mailbox. I mean, it's only 3/4 of a mile away. It was in Hamilton Township. I was in the exact same township. So, I mean, it was just crazy to me that they would bring it up, but they were just grasping at straws for any reason to throw me off the ballot. And that was their big thing.
Yeah, they got super petty trying to find some technicality.
Just this little technicality, even though it was still in the same township. So in the end, they couldn't have thrown me off because there's a law that protects people like me that live in the woods anyhow, as it turns out. So it was a moot point, but it just shows the stupidity not the stupidity, the crassness of these people to use a law like that to try to keep other people off the ballot. They can't fight about ideas. That's what this should be. It should be an arena of ideas on what you're going to bring to Washington. It shouldn't be what your opponent's address is.
Well, there was also more absurd things that I had almost forgotten about that I just thought of in this case. They actually argued that the case at the trial court level was premature, essentially, and not ripe for the court to decide because either John could die before the election or Amanda, his party chair, could die before.
And be replaced by someone else who would sign off for me.
Yes, and they admitted that had the party chair in his county been someone else, he could obtain certification. They actually were ballsy enough to make these arguments in open court. And I remember that my counter during trial was essentially, Your Honor, if the plaintiff's potential death is something that makes a case not ripe, any of us could die at any time. So nothing could be brought in court.
Right. And I didn't want my county chairwoman to pass away. I mean, it's crazy, the stuff they did to try to keep, ordinary people from doing. And they do this every day. And so this is why, I want to remind folks out there, please vote in your primary. I know we are dead last in voter participation, and I know you get very few choices, but together, you and I, we can make choices happen in the future if you show up and vote in your primary. So please, in your next primary, please vote. One interesting thing on the two primary rule, I live in a rural area. We only have primary elections every even year. So it would take me 4 years to qualify to run for office if you live in a rural area. If you live in a city and you have a municipal election that has elections on the odd years, then you can qualify in 2 years. We thought that would be one of the reasons this rule would be thrown out, because it clearly discriminates against people like me that live in the country. I couldn't vote in the municipal election, so I couldn't meet the two primary rule that way. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, John, I think that is one of the many ways that this statute is still vulnerable, even though it was upheld. The court didn't get into that particular piece of the facts. Of course, they wanted to focus on more federal election law, which is murky. So there's that issue. Most people, well, I don't know about most, but a lot of people don't live in the city limits. I don't either. And so there's an equal protection issue where people who live in the city are treated better than people that live in the county. That's going to be an issue that comes up. And also younger voters are discriminated against by this law, because you can run to be an Indiana representative at 21. But if you live in the county and you can't vote in 2 primaries before your 21st birthday, then you wouldn't be able to run just based on your age and happenstance of when your birthday is. We pointed that out to the court as well, but they didn't want to hear it because John's not a 22-year-old. But
there are young people that have ran and have got their county chairs to sign off. So there are good county chairmen out there, like Alan Stevens in LaPorte County. God bless him. There are good people out there. It's just, unfortunately, where I live, there's just a lot of bad stuff going on behind the scenes, and you just wonder what really happened. It's a sad day. Jim Banks had to be forced on Indiana. We had no choice. He was the only person on the ballot. Mitch Daniels wanted to run for the U.S. Senate. He went to Washington and went around the halls to see if he could get some support, but they said, no, we're lining up behind Jim Banks. As I understand it, our governor, Eric Holcomb, also wanted to run for the Senate this time, and he also got told no. So you just wonder what really, really went on behind the scenes if those two very established Indiana Republican politicians couldn't run. I certainly wasn't going to be allowed to run. Why are we being forced to have people like Jim Banks? What's really going on behind the scenes? And
it should be left to voters in any case, right? There shouldn't be a selection prior to the election. And that's what happened to John, and that's what happens to average Hoosiers, is the selection is made and it's taken out of the hands of the Hoosier voters. And that's
selection before election, exactly.
Yes. It's a good slogan, selection
that's a good
before
slogan,
election,
yes.
Yeah.
John, when we come back, I do have a question about the viewers. I mean, the listeners may not realize this, but you did write a book about your journey, some history. Could we elaborate on that when we come back?
Yes, we'll get into that. I wrote a book called Unsilencing the 81%, and we'll come into that right when we come back. So stay tuned. This is John Rust on Freedom 95. Good morning. Once again, this is John Rust on the John Rust Show. I am here with Michelle Harder, who is an attorney at law, and the Aaron Brockovich of the Indiana election law, and Mike Wilson, provocateur of interesting thoughts and ideas. So we'll get into that in a little bit. Before the break, Mike was asking me about the book I wrote. I wrote a book called Unsilencing the 81%, How One Hoosier is Fighting for the Rights of All Hoosiers to Run for Political Office. So I am still doing that today. So in the process of all this, we won at the state court level. Then we had to go and be appealed to the Indiana Supreme Court. Unfortunately, Michelle, do you want to go in with what happened there?
So the Indiana Supreme Court took this case on an expedited basis because the state essentially pushed them to do so, claiming that the election was imminent and they needed to settle election law. And they got an injunction so that they took the victory from us, essentially. We had this huge, exciting trial court victory with Judge Dietrich, who wrote this beautiful, eloquent love letter to Hoosier voters. And then the Indiana Supreme Court took it all away at the state's request to make it so John couldn't appear on the ballot. And so we had a split opinion, a 3-2. So we lost by one vote, a 3-2 in favor of upholding the law. That opinion left some questions unanswered.
But, Michelle, I thought the timing was still in my favor. I'm not a lawyer, and I think what surprised me was that they could apply that rule ex post facto, after the fact. At the time I filed for my Senate candidacy and filed all my 15,000 signatures, the law as it stood, I was completely fine, and that's why I did not move to another county to get another county chairman's approval to run, even though I could have, because I thought, well, it's legal right now. What stands is they will not be able to take that away from me. As I understood it, you could not make a rule ex post facto, but I was wrong. Do you want to get into that?
Yeah, so I think what you're talking about is just fundamental fairness, where people don't expect that the law is going to be retroactive, where, like you said, you were eligible at the time that you filed your paperwork and then it was taken away. But unfortunately, in Indiana, an ex post facto law only applies to criminal laws. So they can't pass a law that gets you in criminal trouble and have you be punished for past conduct. But in terms of a civil case like this one, there really isn't such a prohibition. So that's exactly what they did. They took your victory away. And we did go before the Indiana Election Commission, separate and apart from the court system, right? They have their own process administratively to determine candidacies.
Yeah, let's go into that.
Yeah.
So the Indiana Election Commission is who heard this case. And so I was challenged on my paperwork by people from the Jim Banks campaign, because they obviously did not want me on the ballot because they knew I'd win. But
Right.
that's another. The Indiana Election Commission, on the face of it, it looks fair. It's 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. However, the reality is who gets appointed are really, well, I'll let you go into that.
They're appointed by the parties, right? So they have an interest in it. And we were hopeful going into it that they would see that, hey, this law is unconstitutional, and they would allow John on the ballot. And we made arguments about the fact that he was eligible and then it was taken away mid-proceeding, and they weren't buying it. They just wanted to defer to,
And being there in person, it was pretty obvious to me that the decision was preordained.
That's right.
Before we were even in the room.
They were very not interested. They were completely disinterested from what I had to argue. They didn't pay attention to what I said at all.
Both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party is not interested in anyone running for office that they can't control. That's what happened.
And we had, I think, 24 people removed from the ballot that day. Not all of them were removed
At
from
our level, but in county level across the
Yes.
state, I think there were hundreds of people
There
that were
were.
thrown off the ballot.
I got a lot of calls about people being removed at the local level, but besides the state one. But just at the state level, there were at least 24 people removed, not only for this statute, but also for not having signatures and other things.
I want to say to those who are listening who may have ran and got thrown off the ballot, keep voting in your primary and run again. Don't get discouraged. Tomorrow's a new day. Let's go forward.
I hope you take that advice too, John.
Well, we'll see about that. But we still have to do what's right. And I believe in what Ronald Reagan said. The United States is a shining city on a hill. We are the country people want to come to. And we'll get into illegal immigration in a little bit. There is so much wonderful about the United States that we have to fight for. And that's why we need people, not just like me and Michelle and Mike here. We need you, the listener. Please go out and vote in your primary. Please run for office. We need different people. We need fresh blood. We need fresh ideas. There's so much going on that you, the listener, can help with. So back on the petitions, though, I had 15,000 signatures, and I thought at the Indiana Election Commission that would be enough to get me on. That was my naive thoughts on that, because I had so many signatures that these people are, appointed to the Indiana Election Commission by the party, but I thought they would see the grassroots as really for me. The people, wanted someone that they could vote for that wasn't being forced on them.
And there were boxes of petitions that we actually physically hauled into the hearing. And it was, visually stunning to see these boxes that we've stacked up on the desk.
Because the rule of the law, when I applied, I met every threshold. And by 3 times the signature requirement, I met every step of that law. And it was completely legal for me to run for the U.S. Senate when I filed. But, the ex post facto law took it out, and that negated all those 15,000 signatures. So if you signed one of those petitions for me, thank you. Hopefully we'll be doing it again someday, maybe. You never know. Also, just a general word to the listener out there. If you're at a Walmart or wherever and someone has a petition signature, please sign it. It is really hard to get it, and it doesn't mean you're endorsing that candidate, but it means that you think there should be a choice, and you think the voters should be able to choose who the candidates are, not the party leaders. It is hard to get the signatures. It was very hard to get 15,000 signatures. But I think it was something worthwhile because I want to do what's right, and I want to do what was by the letter of the law.
I also want to add that I tried to collect signatures myself once, and in 2 hours only got about 3 signatures. And I'm a lawyer, and I spend my life convincing people to do things they don't want to do, but it's very hard to get signatures. And they throw out most of the signatures you collect. Well, not most, but they throw out a nice chunk of signatures that you collect on technicalities, like the person moved or...
Right. I think I might have had 21,000 signatures. And of those, I think 14,000 were declared valid at the end.
So,
What was interesting for me is in the 3rd Congressional District, I had way more signatures than my opponent did in his own congressional district, just because people, knew what he's up to there. And they're like, look, we need someone else in Washington. We want someone that'll fight for us and not the insiders. It was very eye-revealing or whatever to see how many people around Fort Wayne said, hey, we want a choice.
yeah, that is remarkable. His own home county didn't vote or didn't turn out for him like they did John. It's also kind of remarkable that here in Indiana, John needed 4,500 signatures. If he ran in my home state of New Jersey, he would have needed just 1,000 signatures and could have signed an affidavit saying he's a Republican, and he would have been on the ballot. So he would have sailed onto the ballot in another state. But here in Indiana, he had to get all these signatures, and then obviously...
Well, the threshold's very high. You talk about that. And, I had the resources to, have people go out and get the signatures. For someone that doesn't have the resources, I think that it would be more fair to have a lower threshold. I think, you mentioned 1,000, maybe 2,000. The 4,500, that's a lot of signatures. It still should be so that anyone can run.
It's a high threshold with both the party requirement and the votes.
All right, John, another question. The signatures, was there a particular demographic that wanted to sign your petition?
For me, I always found
Or
it
not
was
petition,
it was working people.
Okay.
People that work for a living, because they are so upset with what career politicians are doing to people that work.
What about young people? Were there any young people that were interested?
Oh, absolutely.
So to speak.
All over across the state, people really wanted to sign the petitions, and I was so in love with how that was happening. It was a great thing. So, Michelle, we lost at the Indiana State Supreme Court. After that, you want to go into what happened next?
We did file a petition for certiorari in the U.S. Supreme Court on this case, arguing that federal election law is inconsistent, and we wanted the U.S. Supreme Court to take it up. Unfortunately, though, they only take up about 1% of cases annually, and so the odds, of course, were against us, and they did decline to take the case, which doesn't mean that the case wasn't worthy. It's just they have to choose very carefully, and this wasn't one they were interested in. I do expect that someone will get this law struck down here in Indiana because it still has a few avenues to be challenged, and the opinion in this case was split and sort of confusing and murky. So stay tuned on that. Hopefully they don't change the law to add a third primary or other requirements, certainly, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Okay. Well, Michelle, it's sad that the United States Supreme Court did not take the case, but it was less than 1% are taken, and we will fight on another day.
Yes,
so
we
this
will.
is John Rust on Freedom 95, but I want to close with my father's favorite Bible verse, Psalm 118, verse 24. This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next week on the radio.